Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I am Ibrahim Aoude, your host for this evening, and our topic today is after the invasion. So that is the invasion of Iraq, and with us we have two guests, Farideh Farhi from Department of Political Science at UH Mānoa. Thank you for coming. And Ramsis Lutfy, he's a retired professor of zoology, and we'll be talking about the effects of the invasion and ecological, environmental, and political, economics, social, and so on. So to remind you, this is a live show, and we welcome your comments and questions on Oahu 956-5670, Neighbor Island 1-800-342-7949. So please give us a call and join in the conversation. So, Farideh, you are a political scientist, and I was just wondering in terms of what are your first thoughts on the invasion. You know, I'm not calling it a war because of, you know, it's the war that never ended since 1991, 1990, 1991. So your thoughts on the invasion and its implications, environmental, ecological, political, economic, you know, what are your first thoughts when someone asks you such a question?
Well, I'm a political scientist, so I'll focus on the political aspects of it. Even though the military operation obviously went very rapidly, and it ended up with the disintegration of Saddam's regime in Iraq, it's very obvious at this point that the American forces are faced with two fundamental problems. One is a structural problem, which has to do with what can be considered as complete chaos in not only major cities, but also all over Iraq. That includes the disintegration of security forces. Obviously, reports have been around in terms of looting, but also the disintegration of almost all social services. I mean, it's important to understand that because of the sanctions, 2/3 of the Iraqi population was effectively dependent on food handout from the government, and that whole system has disintegrated. And it's very obvious that since the war ended, the occupying forces have not been able to restore some of the basic services that include electricity, water, and of course all sorts of medical services. So that is on one hand a major problem that needs to be taken care of. And secondly, obviously, and I think strangely this is the secondary problem, are the political issues involved. 5-6 weeks after the end of the war, so-called end of the war, no political resolution or no political vision of what has to happen in Iraq has yet to happen. There has not been any agreement about what kind of interim government will come into effect. There have been some provisional discussions, but in terms of how the relationship between the exiled forces and forces that exist in the country will work out has not been worked out. So on those two fundamental issues, it is very clear that the after effects of what you call an invasion are still being felt in very, very drastic ways.
Yeah, and for the population, the daily needs need to be met, and you know, there are disasters, and environmental disasters in terms of, you know, health, in terms of water, in terms of all kinds of things. So Ramsis, could you speak to that and other kinds of
so actually it's a tremendous disaster. As you said, of course, it isn't a single war, it's a series. And since it started in the first Gulf War, the damage to the environment in the area, in particular, in Iraq in particular, and the area all around the Middle East, was huge because of the burning up of the oil, for example, because of the use of certain weapons that are sort of internationally prohibited, like, for example, the depleted uranium munition that the American forces used there, and the failure of the amenities because of the war. And of course, this continued with the sanctions through until the next phase of the war, which is this one, the new campaign or the new invasion of Iraq. And all the sewage system, the water system, the contaminants that had been spreading all over Iraq and possibly in the air all over the region haven't been sort of looked into since then, but the repercussions on the population of Iraq are tremendous. Mm-hmm. There are statistics showing the effects of all these contaminants, for example, and the nuclear effects of the use of the uranium, the depleted uranium, increasing the cases of cancer and birth defects and genetic abnormalities and all that, which shows that this area now, Iraq, is a disaster environmentally, and it cannot continue like that. And I don't know, I haven't seen any news about the occupying forces or the occupying authority in Iraq now turning to these humanitarian sides. I mean, all we hear is about stupid little things happening there, and further exposing the Iraqi population to dangers that are tremendous.
Yeah, you were saying something about how some people are raiding nuclear
yes, yes,
could
this
you
is tonight.
Say to that?
Yeah, it's fantastic. Tonight, some Iraqi, teenagers are shown getting into nuclear facilities, Iraqi nuclear facilities. I don't know if it was a power station or something, and stripping certain parts of the plants, stripping the metal roofings, and getting into stores where there are nuclear materials, and taking them. Of course, they don't know what they are. And one of the things that was mentioned, yellow plutonium cakes or something like that, and they're taking these things and building them up. They found tanks or something, and they use these facilities or these parts to patch up their own homes.
Wow.
Not knowing that these things can kill them in a very short time.
Where's the American forces?
Somewhere.
Somewhere else.
Somewhere else, yes.
Yeah, you wanted to jump in here.
One of the difficulties that happened actually had to do with nuclear sites. As you well know, one of the main reasons for one of the reported reasons for attacking Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. Now, what happened essentially was that many of the sites, the nuclear sites, were not protected immediately as the American forces came in. And the effective result was that, like many other places, many of those sites were looted. Now, one of the difficulties that is occurring at this point is because of the disagreements that the United States has had with various international institutions, and particularly with the inspection regime of the United Nations, is that the United States is not allowing members of the International Atomic Energy Agency to go into Iraq to try to assess exactly what has happened in those sites, because the inspectors were effectively the ones that knew exactly what was there before. And members of IAEA are begging the United States to let them go in and try to see what has happened, to take a stock, but because of international disagreements, that is not happening. So a lot of people are effectively very worried about loose nuclear material, not merely because they are worried about youth taking them and of course being contaminated by them, but effectively because they are worried that these material might actually leave Iraq and end up in the hands of people that should not end up in precisely the same reason for which the United States went into war, which was to prevent these from getting into the hands of people.
It's actually tragicomic. I mean, it's a comedy that makes you cry, because the main pretext for attacking Iraq was the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq had. And of course, to quieten the world around and to appease the United Nations and all that, they sent in, or accepted to send in the inspectors to find these things. Every few days now, we get news that here we have found some stash, some store where there are weapons of mass destruction. We only have to affirm that by analysis. And then a few days later, no news. And another one. A couple of days ago, they found a trailer with biological weapons, serious biological weapons, and nothing. And of course, this is going to put the United States in a very embarrassing situation, if it is not already in an embarrassing situation, because where are these weapons of mass destruction that you went to find and to kick out the regime because it was challenging the whole world on that basis?
Yeah, well, one could say either the U.S. is kind of stupid, or they have something else that they're thinking about in terms of why they are there and so on. Because if you, as Farideh is saying, if you don't want to protect those kinds of nuclear material, why you are interested in stopping weapons of mass destruction? Why aren't you trying to have other people assist you, especially if you don't have the wherewithal to do it,
No.
because they don't have the information as the IAEA has, So why not have the IAEA? What is the imperative for U.S. policy to not have the IAEA? That's the question.
I just mentioned now before when I was talking about this, that the main pretext, not the main reason.
Yes.
The main reason is the hidden agenda of the Bush administration, which is to control the Middle East as a way of enforcing America's hegemony over the world. This is the main thing. It's not, of course, they want the oil, but this is not the end in itself. The end in itself is to prevent any possibility of another power coming up to compete with the United States or to nudge it out of the number one position over the globe.
Yeah, but in doing so, I mean, we have a footage here about, the implications of such an invasion. And even the invasion itself, how armies might be, doing damage to the environment, etc. So sacrifice the environment of a particular area, and by implication the region, to those kinds of goals. So we're gonna show this footage first, and then we can discuss it, and then go into the political implications of that. See if you agree with what Ramsis was saying. Let's go.
You consider, for example, Iraq is apparently about the size of California, and the troops that are moving through Iraq, what is it on a scale of 200,000 or whatever, and all of that machinery, and thousands of bombs and missiles and so forth, some of them fairly concentrated in certain regions. That's bound to have not just an impact on the humans on the ground temporarily, but on the ecology. The whole ecology, including of Baghdad, its urban ecology, including the ecology of the routes that the troops have taken to move and so forth, the toxic residue from those bombs. This isn't something that is just a temporary thing. And once we've changed the regime and we've instituted our version of a democratic government and so forth, that's the end of it. There's no long-term social and environmental consequence here that's negative. And we have precedents. Look at all of the landmines that are in Cambodia and in Angola and various other countries. Look at the long-term legacy of Agent Orange in Vietnam, when it was used decades ago as a defoliant, and now it turns out it's carcinogenic. How much do we really know that we're doing in Iraq right now with all of this bombing and so forth that is going to have long-term costs for the society of Iraq and for the ecology of Iraq? And I just, the whole operation is so myopic, so narrow, so specifically targeted. It's a war with smart bombs and precise bombing of specific targets and so forth, but that's myth. We can't be that precise. And what we're doing is, history will eventually reveal the long-term social and environmental impacts of all of this.
Yeah, and those consequences also travel across oceans, like Gulf War syndrome.
Yes.
I don't know to what extent it is a scientific thing, but in regards to implications, in terms of environmental damage and disaster. But could you comment on what Leslie Sponsor was
yes,
talking
of course. This it's a well-known fact, and now a view. Scientific view or theory that is, has very strong basis, is that the whole world is like a sort of an organism, an entity that is self-adjusting. At the same time, it is a combination of living and non-living components. And we on it are like single cells. Each of us is like a single cell in that organism. Whatever goes round comes round. If I'm sort of contaminating one area, eventually the contamination is going to spread one way or the other through the air, through the sea. I am killing organisms that are essential in the food chains, for example, and this is going to cause trouble everywhere. Not only that. Now, when I find that, as Professor was
Sponsors,
was just talking about Agent Orange, for example, this has been used in Vietnam to defoliate or remove whole forests where the Viet Cong were taking shelter to fight to liberate their country. So, did the United States know the effect of Agent Orange on the environment and on people before or not? This had been used in the United States before by big companies, big corporates, trying to defoliate certain areas in the United States, for example, through certain projects by big corporations. They wanted to get rid of, for example, some weeds or something like that, and they used that in Oregon, and it had tremendous effect on people, causing cancers, causing birth defects, causing genetic mutations, and at the same time, lots of the animals in the area died.
That's before Vietnam?
Before Vietnam.
Okay.
And of course, this was prohibited. The use of Agent Orange, which contains one of the most toxic compounds in the whole world, which is dioxide, has been prohibited in the United States, but it went on in Vietnam. So actually, this is not a human thing. You can't sort of prevent exposing your own people to something and then take it and expose other people.
Yeah, because those guys don't matter, because after all, we are at war with them, and
it's like,
the idea is to defeat them.
Of course, in ecology, this is something which is horrible. The Western world has been taking the nuclear wastes from their nuclear power stations or from their research facilities and putting it in barrels and trying to hide it somewhere or storing it somewhere. In some cases, they would send it to the third world, paying them to store it there. Mm-hmm. So actually, as you said, life in the third world does not have any value compared to life in the first world or the Western countries.
So far as the U.S. is concerned, and maybe other European powers
exactly.
as well. Yes, yeah. So Farideh,
At least two environmental effects in relationship to Iraq are already quite evident. One is what Les Sponsor was talking about in terms of the movement of military hardware. If you remember, it was in the second week of the attack that an incredible sandstorm hit Iraq, that most Iraqis agreed that it was the worst ever. Sandstorms are common, however, the impact of it as well as the extent of it was just incredible. Most people agreed, and many ecologists pointed out that that is partly caused by the degradation of topsoil, top sand in the desert area. So that is something that we will hear about in future years, because that area has been so heavily impacted by the movement of tanks and whatever. Secondly, and this is the second example, is that, and I think that is pretty close to criminal, is that United States used cluster bomb in Iraq. Not all weapons used for precision. United States military says that they used only 1,500 cluster bombs in Iraq, but reporters suggest that that is not true, given the number of incidents. Cluster bombs just spread, and as you well know, they are colored very nicely. So many children are touching these unexploded parts of cluster bombs, and many are, reports are everywhere on a daily basis of children being injured, being maimed, by just simply thinking that these cluster bombs are toys. And the effects of it will be seen for many, many months and years to come.
Yeah, actually this reminds me of something, which is this Ashley Banfield, who is on MSNBC, I believe. And she said, okay, we got rid of a dictator, whatever, and I wonder where Saddam Hussein is, by the way, now, but we got rid of a dictator, etc. But no, not too many people, reporters, embedded reporters, have been talking about the cost of this, in terms of civilian deaths, etc., etc. So she has been sanctioned here. But before we talk more about this, we have Paul, and Paul has this question: should we have gone to war? If so, why? Paul, anybody? Should we have gone to war?
No, I believe now we shouldn't have gone to war at all. And the whole world was against it, because obviously there was another very reasonable way of solving that problem, and it started to work beautifully. And the days now we are going through prove that that was the right thing to do, to let the inspectors do their job. And they were not finding any traces, especially the Atomic Energy Agency. The report was complete absence of any atomic weapons in Iraq.
Yeah.
And there were indications from other sources, intelligence sources, like Saddam's brother-in-law, who defected to Jordan during the 80s, I remember.
Son-in-law?
No.
Oh, brother-in-law?
Brother-in-law. I think his brother-in-law. And he came out and told the intelligence community in the United States intelligence that Saddam didn't have any weapons of mass destruction.
But they didn't believe him. That's why.
That's right. I mean,
they wanted to hear the answer that they believe in, even though it might have been wrong.
I think it's a pretext. It wasn't an actual sort of conviction that they actually sort of were sure that there was weapons of mass destruction. I would like to refer to something I saw in the email only 2 days ago about the depleted uranium that has been used in 1961. The American and British forces going into Iraq were protected against depleted uranium that was left from the First World War, so the First Gulf War, and also from any new depleted uranium that was going to be used in this one.
Yeah.
And there is a very important authority in depleted uranium effects.
Hello?
Who mentions that.
Yeah. I think there is a caller from Kapa'a, Tom from Kapa'a, and then we can integrate those questions. Tom, you're on the air.
Yes, I'm a Gulf War veteran, as a matter of fact, and I'm glad you finally brought up the depleted uranium. I was waiting for a while. And as far as an environmental problem, I think that's what we have as a country. We're going to have to face that as a liability. And in the future, I mean, I have Gulf War illness, and depleted uranium is one of the items that, they're now looking at, very staunchly. So there's a good possibility that that's what caused it. Also, Mycoplasma fermentans incognitus. It is a something that's in my blood, and it's a mycoplasma that doesn't occur in nature normally. And this mycoplasma was given to Saddam Hussein from our government, as a matter of fact.
Yes, that's true.
So that's something I'm suffering from right now, as a matter of fact. So this is a very good show, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Tom.
That's all I have to really comment about. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so.
Thank you. Of course, the results of research and observation, both in Iraq after the first Gulf War and in the United States on veterans that were in that war, are horrendously showing an increase in the rate of cases of cancers, especially which is called acute myeloblastic leukemia. Myeloblastic leukemia. This is a kind of
Tom was talking about that. Yeah.
Kind of cancer of the blood, and there is no effort to try and clean this mess that was left by the American forces in 1991. And it is going to cost a whole lot of trouble, because this expert in depleted uranium is saying that to get rid of this depleted uranium, you have to take the piece of equipment that was hit by the munition that had depleted uranium and try to transfer it completely from the area and process it somehow to get rid of the depleted uranium.
How are you going to do that?
And then in a circle of 100 meters around the place where that piece of equipment or tank or whatever it is, you have to remove 10 centimeters depth of the soil. And if you leave anything, that traces of depleted uranium is going to stay there for 4.5 billion years.
Yeah.
Billion years. By that time, Saddam will have been pulverized.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that these are environmental effects, but they are not only environmental. They have political consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, even to the stature of the United States and to the position of the United States in the region. I mean, could you speak to that, Farideh?
Precisely. I mean, Ramsis talked about perhaps American desire to use what has happened in Iraq as a platform for hegemony in the Middle East, control of the Middle East, improvement of American standing in the Middle East. But the reality is that so long as the situation in Iraq is one of desperation, one of lack of improvement, one of environmental degradation. The record is a very bad one, and United States definitely has a black mark on its head at this point for not being able and not foreseeing and not taking care of all the problems that it has been initiated because of the attack on Iran. A previous caller had asked, should the United States should it have invaded? I mean, my position was from the beginning, and I came to it in a very, very difficult way, because I find Saddam Hussein very offensive. I found Saddam Hussein as being someone who had brought havoc and chaos to the region, and therefore needed to be removed. And therefore the humanitarian mission of the war to get rid of Saddam Hussein, as far as I was concerned, was the only legitimate reason for engaging in the war, because all the other aspects or all the other pretexts that were mentioned were simply, given the evidence that existed, were not viable evidence. However, from the beginning, those of us who ended up opposing the war argued that the United States is unable and incapable of taking care of the consequences of its own action in Iraq. We were worried about the kind of situation that is unfolding, both, as I suggested before, structurally in terms of the total breakdown of the infrastructure of Iraq, given the 12 years of sanctions that had existed before, that had in a very strange way had empowered Saddam Hussein vis-a-vis his own population, and also because we felt that the United States was not ready to handle the political consequences of the situation. And these worries are unfortunately unfolding in front of our eyes, and the United States will ultimately, I think not United States government, American people will pay for all this.
Yeah, but already, I mean, they have paid through the Gulf War syndrome. I mean, directly the people who were involved directly in the war. There, you know,
I've seen. I don't know if you have seen that film. It was shown here on the university campus, and it was like the Secret Wars of Desert Storm.
Right.
It was mainly concentrated on the vets, the American vets that came back from the war, and most of them, like the gentleman who was talking just now, they are suffering from terrible symptoms and the Gulf War syndrome and so on, and they are either ignored by the Pentagon or the American administration, or they are secretly being sort of accommodated one way or the other.
Yeah, so that's I mean, disturbing thing. I mean, for the American people, if you really want to look into it, it's a disturbing consequence. You know, I mean, beyond the other consequences in terms of economic problems for the United States because of the war and all that kind of stuff. But we can talk more about that. But I'm wondering, like, in terms of the question of hegemony, American hegemony. You mentioned this American hegemony in terms of globalization and the effects of making this quote-unquote one world in economic terms, neoliberal kind of stuff. I'm wondering, between that notion of hegemony, U.S. hegemony in a global world, as opposed to U.S. domination, that is to say, it doesn't want to play ball with anybody, France, Germany, Russia,
unilateralism,
China, unilateralism in terms of we have the power to dominate the world, you know, as opposed hegemony of the global process, whereby we can make deals with the French and the rest of them, you see. So I wonder, what do you think about those kinds of things?
I don't think that this sort of point of view or attitude by the administration or the American administration in general developed suddenly. It had been developing since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower. And then during the Reagan years, the attempt at concentrating and increasing the military power of the United States, in preparation for what? If you don't have a strong opponent, who are you going to try and destroy or war against? Who are you going to try to war against? So what is happening during this period is that the neoconservatives in the Republican Party started to think about small wars. A series,
they can win.
Series of small wars that would ensure the complete sort of control of the world under this American umbrella. And these wars are supposed mainly to have happened, well, largely, I don't say mainly, but largely in the Middle East, because of the nationalistic movements and freedom movements that were boiling in the Middle East, trying to get rid of the dominance of the Western world on the Middle East that had lasted for centuries.
Yeah. But here, you know, the other thing, I mean, the question of Iraq looms large. I mean, even if it's a small country compared to the United States in terms of military power, etc., the U.S. is having problems, you know, as opposed to Grenada, for instance. Maybe they should have gone to the Caribbean and done those kind of stuff in the Caribbean, you know. But you were going to say something.
Well, I mean, there are two phases to the operation.
Right.
I mean, the underpinning logic of the neoconservative argument has been that American military dominance, in effect, gives the United States the privilege of unilateralism. Now, that worked within the, if you think of the war in the case of Iraq,
quote
only
unquote. It
worked.
They went and destroyed everything.
Exactly, and brought Saddam's statue down and effectively and declared the war ended. Okay, obviously, however, in the process of convincing the world that the United States has a right as well as the might to invade Iraq, the American neoconservatives had to promise the world a lot of things, including the idea that they were going to bring prosperity to Iraq, they were going to bring democracy to Iraq, they were going to bring not only democracy to Iraq but also the whole Middle East. They were going to take care of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. So that's a full agenda. So Iraq, in effect, has become the test case for this whole argument for American might. And it is here that I think Americans are coming face to face with their own limitations. Obviously, they began with this whole argument that the United States does not need anybody to help it in the reconstruction of Iraq, except the few allied powers or the coalition partners, coalition of willing. But increasingly, they are finding out that the United States is uniquely incapable or unsuitable for the task it has set for itself. And let me just give you two reasons for that. One is the fact that you know, in order to go to a country to rebuild it, you have to have at least some basic elements. The United States simply does not have the cadres to do it. I mean, just look at the people who are involved. None of them spoke Arabic. None of them knew how to connect to the population. Just the whole infrastructure that was developed had very, very few people knowledgeable about how to run an empire in the Arab world. So that is a basic limitation that they came face to face with. There is also an additional problem, Ibrahim, which is Americans, of course, are very concerned about their security in Iraq. In fact, at this point, it is not at all clear who is the head of the operation for the reconstruction of Iraq. Is it General Tommy Franks, who is mainly concerned about the security of American forces, or are there so-called leaders of the Office of Reconstruction of Iraq, Jay Garner and now Paul Bremer? That means that because of the concern about the security, most of the people that have gone into various cities in Iraq, particularly in Baghdad, are forced to live in a bubble. They are not allowed to interact with the population because they are afraid of their own security. So how could you have people that are interested in rebuilding a country effectively living in an isolated bubble because they are so concerned about their security?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember this joke a long time about when the Iranian Revolution happened. And, you know, the Americans wanted to know more about Islam and so on. So the joke was, they're now speed reading the Quran, you know, as though the Quran could be speed read. And the other thing now here, you know, not too many cadre who speak Arabic. And, you know, Arabic is a very difficult language and has many dialects, etc. What kind of Arabic are you? If you know Egyptian, you cannot really speak Iraqi, you know, for instance, and you wouldn't understand, you know, anyway.
There is also the additional problem, which is that because this operation essentially has been a Defense Department operation that mistrusts the State Department, most of the people who speak Arabic are in the State Department and are distrusted as essentially pro-Arab sentimentalists by the defense folks. So they are effectively being pulled out. So you also have the additional problem of this bureaucratic interfighting that is preventing effective operation from happening.
But it makes me laugh when they say the Defense Department says that all those pro-Arabists in the State Department are not trusted. When I say pro-Arabists, these guys, you know, are anti-Arabist. But anyway, you know, it's a matter of perspective. You know,
the thing is, in many cases, laughable, and actually the whole venture or adventure of going into Iraq was a very short-sighted thing. Because you can't, I mean, how can you bring democracy on the sort of, on the top of a tank and just put it there? How
do you think we are, you know, Yeltsin in Russia?
Yeah, you know, how can you claim that?
Yeah, even Yeltsin wasn't.
And of course, the United States is sort of accused of other wars where democracy was being burnt or being destroyed in some countries, actually. I mean, of course, you remember Chile and
yeah, of course, Allende. I mean, you know, he was toppled. He was democratically elected and toppled by the United States. Kissinger played a criminal role in that. I just want to read this from an anonymous caller. It's a comment. Thanks to the panel for giving honest answers. It is a rare treat on TV. I used to think America had no culture, but now I think America's culture is racism. So, you know, we alluded to something like that in terms of how third world people's lives are
not as valuable. Of course.
If valuable at all. And it's not like a matter of judgment just like that. It's a matter of what's happening on the ground. I mean,
actually, it's tragic that the whole pretext, which was the bringing down of Saddam Hussein's regime, is heartbreaking as far as the nation of Iraq, the Iraqi people, the everyday people of Iraq that are walking the streets of Baghdad and the different cities of Iraq are the ones that suffered while Saddam Hussein stole the money and ran out. And what happened? I mean, where is the aim? Where is the great sort of goal of this war? Is it destroying Iraq again and again and again and killing its people and exposing them to contamination and death by cancer and all that?
Well, talking about contamination, we have another segment from Les Sponsel. He's talking specifically about oil and economy based around oil. So when the tape is ready, we can like roll, and then we talk about it and see to what extent this war is also about oil in terms of domination and so on.
We know what the byproducts of oil are. The byproducts of oil are the problems of air pollution that we see when we fly into cities in airplanes, and the gray, brownish haze on the horizons of cities like LA and Chicago and so forth and so on. And what's that doing to the health of the people that live there? And we know about the hole in the ozone layer. We know about global warming. and sea level rise, which is inundating some low islands in the Pacific and elsewhere and threatening their security. And so this addiction to oil and to controlling oil is really a blind path that is ultimately leading to the destruction of our environment and to the destruction of us.
Here again, we see the connection between the environment and politics. I mean, and the consequences if you do not take care of these kind of problems. I mean, they not only come to haunt you, but really, you know, explode in your face, so to speak. You know. So could you speak to that?
Actually, the whole political atmosphere in the United States is becoming more and more retrogressive. I don't know if retrogressive is right or not, but you find that now Congress and the election of the president and the congressmen is controlled by the PACs, the political action committees. And the richer the political action committee, the more it's going to contribute to the election of a certain person that they select out and bring to power. And then this person has to pay back that debt. So paying back means that he is going to do a service for these big corporations and big PACs. So the oil, for example, the oil industry in the United States, or the arms industry in the United States, they have their own ways of bringing into Congress and electing presidents that are going to be conveniently forced to pay them back. So why is oil still being used to that extent? Why are the SUVs running all around the United States polluting more and more?
Because of soccer moms.
Why aren't there certain environmental protection laws being passed? Why are the standing environmental protection laws being withdrawn or loosened or weakened?
Relaxed, you know, so that they can.
Why are the greenhouse gases still being spewed into the whole world? And the United States contributes more than 25% of the whole world, while they constitute only 5% of the population of the world.
But
why does the United States, in spite of this, all these greenhouse gases the professor was talking about, still spewing out? It is because, I mean, at the same time, the United States says no to Kyoto. No. We don't ratify this agreement.
Well, here we come again to major political questions. I mean, these are political questions that have to do with power and domination inside the United States
and outside.
You know. But if you would like to comment on this also, but you alluded, in fact, to the question of Israel, you know, and maybe we should maybe talk about what's happening now in terms of the roadmap, etc., because there have been articles in Foreign Affairs, like last year and even this year, talking about the road to Palestine goes through Baghdad, you know. So would you like to talk about, you know, those kinds of issues?
I do, but before doing let me talk a little bit about the oil question, not in terms of its environmental aspect, but in terms of its political aspect and the question of Iraqi oil in particular, because that is indeed the touchy issue at this point, for several reasons. First of all, we are still far away from the situation where oil companies actually would become interested in actually engaging in production and
oil,
exploration of new fields in Iraq. Iraq is considered to be to have the second highest oil reserves in the world, but as far as the oil companies are concerned, their interest in Iraq cannot become very pronounced unless the question of ownership of Iraqi oil is clarified. So that's one point. So, but the companies that have always been interested in the situation in Iraq and have promoted, in effect, the war, the attack, are actually companies like Halliburton that are actually oil drilling companies. That is to say, companies that will go and fix oil fields. So that distinction needs to be made, and obviously they are benefiting greatly, both directly and also through their subsidiaries, because they are involved in the process of reconstructing the oil fields. But there is an additional problem in terms of the sale of oil, because the oil companies do not want to touch Iraqi oil because it is at this point not clear, because Iraq effectively doesn't have a government, and the oil companies do not want to touch Iraqi oil because of possible lawsuits later on. So that is why the United States is now asking the United Nations, ironically, at this point, to declare the United States the occupying power. I mean, remember, United States was the liberating power, but not the occupying power. But because of the technical legal situations that are involved, United States now wants the United States to declare United Nations to declare United States the occupying power, so United States can get control over the sale of oil, not ownership of oil, which still has to be taken care of. So that's one important political battle that will be fought at the international level, and obviously you can see why the Europeans and the Russians.
That was my question. I mean, why would the Europeans and the Russians want to assist the United States in that?
They will not. They will not. I mean, certainly they will not. And you know, we will see that the battle in the United Nations will become rather nasty over that
because the other Europeans, you know, that Iraqi oil is denied them. So why should they assist the United States? Unless the United States now wants to play ball again, but then that would have defeated the purpose of it going alone without the United Nations blessing.
Well, you can't exonerate France, for example, completely from this.
Absolutely.
France was against the United States going to war. And once the war was over in a few days, the elephant has squashed a little mosquito or a flea, and we have triumphed over that big power. Come on, and it's laughable. And once they saw that the United States is in complete control of Iraq, they started to say, well, we didn't know that they were going to meet you with open arms.
Yeah, what open arms?
But I think that at that time, France started to feel that it has had contracts with Iraq, and it wanted to protect these contracts.
Sure. Yeah, but back to the question of Israel, because I think it's very important, because what's unfolding on the ground, and that has implication in terms of a regional, widening of these problems. You know, I mean, not only environmental, political, etc., but I'm talking combat. You know, here. You know, I mean, not talking short term necessarily. I mean, intermediate term and longer term. Yeah.
Well, part of the way the war was sold or advertised was obviously based on this notion that Iran will become the cornerstone of democracy in
Iraq,
the Middle East. Iraq, I'm sorry. Iraq will become the cornerstone of democracy, and then set the stage for a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. And there were even discussions that as soon as Iraq became liberated, quote unquote, Iraq, and had its government, Iraq would be the first Arab, not the first, but recognize Israel, and obviously all sorts of other things will ensue from there. all these things obviously are up in the air because the situation, as I said, both in terms of infrastructural development and political development have not happened. And also because the United States had promised the Europeans, but more specifically Britain, that the roadmap would be put on the table immediately after the war, that process has begun, but as you well know, it has immediately faced problems. Prime Minister Sharon has effectively taken a very, very hardline stance on the question of settlers, and it's gone nowhere. It is Israelis who are saying we are not going to play that game just because you want to appease Prime Minister Blair in England. We will not do this the way you want to. And as you know, today they moved in, closed Gaza refugee camp, and the situation in Gaza is very, very even more tense than usual. So that process itself has not gone off the ground. And from the beginning, it was very, very clear that this whole notion that you can go into Iraq and then fix the whole Middle East, while this much, much bigger problem, which is the Palestinian-Israeli question, is simmering.
And the U.S. doesn't do anything for the Palestinians.
Exactly, is idealistic. Yeah. On the other hand, there is this other question about Islamic, political Islam or radical Islam in the Middle East, which again also we saw the consequences of it today in terms of what happened in Saudi Arabia. The attack that was made against the headquarters of an American company, subsidiary of Grumman, that happened to be the company that trains the Saudi Arabian National Guard. So it was a very, very clear attack on not only American military presence in Saudi Arabia, but also all sorts of American business interests in Saudi Arabia. So again, that problem, the so-called war against terrorism, is simmering on this side, and of course the Palestinian-Israeli problem simmers on the other side. And there was, this whole notion that we go to Iraq and then everything will be fixed was simply a fantasy.
And it's interesting, the Palestinian situation. The United States, when Powell went to Israel, he basically got a kick in the collie from Sharon. I mean, that's basically it, to put it diplomatically.
Not today, not in the future. He says.
I mean, he's not willing to play just as you said.
I think that the United States Middle East policy is suffering from two things. Short-sightedness, number one. This sort of obstinacy in doing the wrong thing all the time. Number two is that there is a kind of Catholic marriage between the United States and Israel. They considered Israel as their main agent in this area. So, and of course, there is the political side of the thing. The neoconservatives, actually, the Bush administration's whole structure is based on neoconservatives, Christian Zionists, and big corporations. These are the main pillars on which the administration stands. And these are in complete conviction that the situation has to go on like this if we are going to control this area.
Right. I mean, this is a problem, and the United States, I think, it's blinded by its power. So you have this arrogance of power, and also it's imperative for doing what it needs to do to dominate. Which is not really succeeding thus far, and you would wonder if it is succeeding. We have a few seconds left, but you go ahead.
I wanted to say that in order to go to war, United States made two promises. One, that it will improve the lives of Iraqis.
Right.
Okay, and secondly, that it will bring the peace process and help to create a just peace in the occupied territories. I think we should hold the United States responsible.
Of course,
and make sure that it will do that.
And if not, who's going to invade the U.S.? Anyway, so thank you very much for coming, and thanks for watching, and thank you for your participation as well. Aloha, and see you next time around.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's good.